Good afternoon. You're watching the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Netanyahu threatens to strike Iran if necessary. Soleimani tells terrorists that missiles against Israel are not enough. The Israel-Lebanon oil dispute reaches a high point. Up to 200 Russian mercenaries killed in clash with U.S. forces in Syria. Egyptian army plans to push ISIS terrorists out of Sinai. Turkey is urged to stop attacking Afrin. And now to our top stories. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke at the Munich Security Conference Sunday and stated that if necessary, Israel would strike Iran directly.
The commander of the Revolutionary Guard, Ali Jafri, said, "We're on the path to the rule of Islam worldwide." That means right here, too. This is, in my judgment, the greatest threat to our world. Not just to Israel, not just to our Arab neighbors, not just to Muslims far and wide, but to you as well. Because once armed with nuclear weapons, Iran's aggression will be unchecked, and it will encompass the entire world.
At the conference, Netanyahu held up a piece of the Iranian drone, which Israel captured over its airspace, and said the following.
Iran also denies that it committed an act of aggression against Israel last week, that it sent a drone into our airspace to threaten our people. Well, here's a piece of that Iranian drone, or what's left of it after we shot it down. I brought it here so you can see it for yourself. Mr. Zarif, do you recognize this? You should. It's yours. You can take back with you a message to the tyrants of Tehran. Do not test Israel's resolve.
Netanyahu warned of the dangers posed to the world by a nuclear-armed Iran. Tehran plans to dominate Syria and move its bases and army near Israel, acquire Mediterranean naval bases, and transfer thousands of Shiite fighters to Syria. He said that Israel will prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military presence in Syria. Despite the atrocities that Iran is capable of, Netanyahu says there could be one positive result from Iran's threat.
Now, there has been one positive consequence of Iran's growing aggression in the region. It's brought Arabs and Israelis closer together as never before. And in a paradoxical way, this may pave the way for a broader peace and ultimately also for a Palestinian-Israeli peace.
After his speech, Netanyahu was asked about the military escalation after the drone incident. He replied that it is up to Iran, which is changing the ground rules. He held up a map showing areas where ISIS and Iran have influence, saying, quote, "The unfortunate thing is that as ISIS compresses, Iran moves in." Debka File reports that there were many questions surrounding Iran's motive in launching its Sega drone into Israeli airspace last Saturday. After the drone crossed from Jordan into Israel, 2 Israeli Air Force Apaches captured the Iranian drone, which was flown to the Israeli airbase near Haifa, where it was deposited to military engineers for inspection. Debka military intelligence sources report that Tehran did not realize that the drone mission was in fact playing into the hands of U.S. intelligence to get back at Iran for capturing the U.S. RQ-170 Sentinel drone 8 years ago, after which Tehran claimed it had succeeded in replicating the drone and had taken control of the U.S. spy satellite's communication systems. Last Saturday, the U.S. intelligence turned the tables on Tehran to capture the RQ-170. Their trap lured the Iranian aerial vehicle to the Jordanian River and into the Israeli airspace, where Israeli assault helicopters were prepared to take it down. The IDF is launching a probe to discover whether the Combat Engineering Unit observed safety protocols last Saturday when a bomb that was hidden at the Gaza border fence exploded, injuring 4 servicemen. The protocol requires bomb specialists to verify that suspicious areas are clear of explosives, and if they're found, to neutralize them. On Saturday, when they approached a Palestinian flagpole behind the fence, it blew up, injuring an officer, a commander, and 2 soldiers. IDF chiefs may have been more prepared if they had taken precautions after a speech made by Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Al-Quds force, who spoke on the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Hezbollah's military chief. He said that launching missiles at Israel is not enough and, quote, the regime must not survive. The commander of the military arm of Hamas, Ezzedine al-Qassem, carried out his plans just 2 days later when a concealed bomb hidden by a Palestinian flag injured 4 Israelis. Debka File reports that rather than accepting a U.S. broker deal for the area called Block 9, drawn by a U.S. mediator in 2012, which gives Lebanon 60% and Israel 40% of the maritime waters, Hezbollah and Iran have made Israel's offshore gas and oil fields a war front. 6 years ago, the U.S. tried to mediate a dispute over Block 9. At that time, the U.S. controlled Middle East energy markets, and Israel believed that its offshore gas and oil fields could supply Europe's annual consumption, turning Israel into a Middle East energy power. But Beirut did not accept the U.S. compromise then, nor does it accept it now. Israel missed the boat on taking advantage of the gas and oil fields and now has reason to regret the rejection of Putin's offer to Netanyahu for Russian state firms to develop those fields, finance a pipeline network to Europe, and provide security for the project. Putin claimed that neither Hezbollah nor Iran would attack rigs and pipelines under Russian ownership and protection. At the time, Netanyahu rejected his offer for the sake of Israel's ties with the U.S. This dispute puts Israel at a major disadvantage against its enemies. Lebanese Energy Minister Cesar Abi Khalil had this to say.
يحاول العدو الإسرائيلي أن يعتدي على حقوقنا السيادية في مياهنا البحرية، إذ يعلن زوراً حقوقاً مزعومة له في الموارد البترولية المحتملة في الرقعة رقم 9 من مياهنا البحرية اللبنانية. إننا أكدنا ونعيد التأكيد دائماً أن الرقعة رقم 9 تقع ضمن المياه البحرية اللبنانية، وإنها خاضعة بشكل تام وناجز لسيادة الدولة اللبنانية، ونؤكد اليوم أن أنشطة الاستكشاف فيها ستتم بصورة كاملة كما ستتم في الرقعة رقم 4.
Since the U.S. controls the oil fields and gas plants of eastern Syria, Israel's Mediterranean oil and gas facilities could be held hostage by Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria. A deal is dependent on the U.S. and Russia reaching an agreement about Syria. Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah had stated that if the Lebanese Defense Council decides, Hezbollah is ready to disable Israel's offshore gas installations at any time.
البلوك 9 هي معركة الجنوب؟ لا، هي معركة كل لبنان. المنطقة الاقتصادية في الجنوب مع فلسطين محتلة، هذه الحدود هي معركة الجنوب؟ لا، هي معركة كل لبنان. هذا أولا. ثانيا، يجب أن نعرف أن الموضوع الأساسي للنزاع اليوم هو ليس الحدود البرية. الحدود البرية حلتها سهلة، والموضوع الأساسي هو الحدود البحرية.
Meanwhile, Washington continues to send arms and funds to Beirut, despite the fact that Hezbollah takes the first cut. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has been trying to settle the feud which Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt have been fighting with Qatar. Until now, Israel potentially had 3 Iranian Hezbollah fronts to face. Hezbollah's threat to its offshore gas and oil fields has added a 4th. Tillerson visited Beirut last week to attempt to broker 2 disputes between the Lebanese government and Israel: the drilling rights in the Mediterranean gas and oil fields and the fence that Israel is building along its border with Lebanon against Hezbollah intrusions.
Hezbollah is not just a concern for the United States. The people of Lebanon should also be concerned about how Hezbollah's actions and its growing arsenal bring unwanted and unhelpful scrutiny on Lebanon. Hezbollah's entanglement in regional conflicts threatens the security of Lebanon and has destabilizing effects in the region.
When Tillerson arrived, he expected to meet Lebanese President Aoun as well as the Speaker, Prime Minister, and Foreign Minister Hariri. Before he arrived, Hariri called a meeting for a unified stance regarding Tillerson brokering the oil field dispute. Previously, Washington proposed that to extract oil and gas from the Mediterranean, Lebanon should abide by the Frederick-Hoff line. On January 26th, Lebanon declared it would not hesitate to exercise its right to self-defense against an armed attack on its maritime operations. On January 31st, Israel Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said that the area was in dispute. In response, Nasrallah threatened to attack Israel's Mediterranean gas rigs. David Satterfield, acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, recently visited Beirut and attempted to mediate the dispute between Israel and Lebanon on two issues. The first was a compromise on the Block 9 drilling rights against a U.S. guarantee. The second was an agreement on the border wall that Israel is building from the Mediterranean to the town of Metula. This project was initiated in response to repeated threats by Hezbollah to capture parts of northern Israel. Lebanon claims that the Israeli wall enters into its territory at 13 points. Tillerson hoped his visit would ward off a potential dispute between Israel and Lebanon and help the Lebanese government prove it is independent and not bound by the will of Iran or Hezbollah. Yet neither of these missions were successful. Meanwhile, in a military clash between U.S. and Russian forces in Syria, over 200 Russian mercenaries were killed and many more have been injured. Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, declined to comment, saying the Kremlin only tracks data on the country's armed forces. According to a Russian officer, the death toll continues to rise after many of the wounded were flown to Moscow and St. Petersburg hospitals. The Egyptian army is under new orders to implement a comprehensive plan to push all armed groups out of the Sinai Peninsula, the Nile Delta, and the Western Desert. On February 9th, an Egyptian military spokesman said the operation is going forward in all directions to tighten control of Egyptian ports. Debka File military sources report that Egyptian President el-Sisi has taken control of the Egyptian campaign against terror. He has deployed 3 additional brigades of the 2nd and 3rd Armies to Sinai, raising the deployment to 2 full Egyptian divisions. After 235 people were murdered in northern Sinai last November, the president issued a state of emergency and commanded that Egyptian army chiefs abolish ISIS within 3 months. Yet this command was unsuccessful as the terror attacks continued. With the presidential elections approaching, el-Sisi must eliminate the surging violence of ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood before it threatens his elections. However, many political analysts are confident that el-Sisi will win the election.
من المعروف أن يعني موسى هو من أحد مؤيدي الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي بالأساس، وصفحته الرسمية على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي تتخذ من صورة عبد الفتاح السيسي بروفايل له في هذه الصفحات، وأعلن من قبل حتى بعد إعلان ترشحه أعلن أنه يؤيد الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي، وبالتالي هذه الانتخابات أعتقد أنها محسومة.
El-Sisi has a new strategy and has placed the Desert Peninsula under sea, ground, and air blockade. All roads were blocked, electronic media stopped, and schools were shut down. Sisi's goal was to isolate the desert territory of about 61,000 square kilometers from the outside world. Last Thursday, after the operation began, Egyptian Army spokesman al-Rifai announced that 53 had been killed and 675 detained, and 378 terrorist centers were destroyed. Despite this, ISIS smuggled a 23-minute video clip on the internet and threatened 60 million Egyptian voters to boycott the voting stations in March. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had this to say.
Well, I think the commitment the U.S. has to Egypt's security and the fight against terrorism should be evident, and both with the release of about $1 billion of foreign military financing assistance to Egypt to continue to strengthen its capabilities, and also sharing of other approaches to countering terrorism, some of which we can talk about, some of which we can't so easily talk about. But our joint commitment to defeat ISIS is steadfast, and there has been no gap between Egypt and the United States in our joint efforts to confront terrorist and extremism in the region, but most specifically here in Egypt as well.
Meanwhile, moving to Turkey, last Wednesday, Turkey reportedly gained a commando force that specializes in urban guerrilla warfare in Afrin. According to Debka Weekly military sources, Turkey was going through the motions to prepare a battle in order to avoid having to admit that its anti-Kurd operation had been stalled. Ankara needed to shield its reputation after being ordered by Russia to stop using its air force to support its ground operations. Last week, the Russian warned Ankara that any Turkish jet that flew in defiance of the order would be shot down. It turns out Russia was punishing Ankara for sending a military force into the northern province of Idlib. Moscow let Ankara know that its ban on Turkish flights over Afrin would continue until Turkish troops pulled out of Idlib. Hadan Fidan, head of the Turkish National Intelligence, visited Russian Syrian airbase at Khamim last weekend. This marked the first time the Russians had allowed a Western intelligence chief of a NATO member to land at this base. He arrived after Turkey President Erdogan was let down by Putin, who refused to speak to him, and hoped Fidan would speak directly with Russian commanders. But the commanders refused permission for any Turkish raids over Afrin. Erdogan is facing pressure from Washington to end its Afrin expedition. On February 14th, Defense Secretary James Mattis claimed that Ankara's interest in protecting its border was undermining the fight against ISIS. Mattis previously discussed this with Turkish Defense Minister Canikli at a conference of the Global Coalition Against ISIS in Rome. But Canikli defended the operation, accused NATO allies of letting Turkey down, and vowed that Turkey would do whatever it takes to clear its borders of terrorists. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson had this to say.
We recognize the legitimate right of Turkey to secure its borders. We take it seriously when our NATO ally Turkey says it has security concerns. As to Afrin, we call upon Turkey to show restraint in its operation to minimize the casualties to civilians and avoid actions that would escalate tensions in that area.
With us to discuss these issues is Dr. Danny Orbach, military historian from the Departments of History and Asian Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you think Egypt's plans to push all armed groups out of the Sinai will succeed?
Here I'm very pessimistic. I hope they will succeed. But you know, there were so many grandiose military operations in Sinai of the Egyptian army, and each time they declared a success, and every time we need a new military operation. So I don't think we are doing something fundamentally different than the strategies that failed before. In my opinion, there is a deeper problem here. It's a deeper problem for the Egyptian army. The Egyptian army junior officers, officers in the field, cannot take independent initiative. The command structure is very rigid. We are dependent on precise orders, and this is not the way to wage a guerrilla war in the desert. That's why the ISIS militants are always fading away when the Egyptian army is striking, because the army is too rigid. It's not flexible enough to fight such a complicated war, and the Egyptian army was as rigid as inflexible virtually from 1948. So it's a deeper structural problem that the Egyptians will have to solve before there will be any real gains in the field.
How do you think the upsurge of violence will affect the upcoming elections?
Well, Sisi has no competition. So the candidates which are running against him are virtually fake candidates. It's Sisi against Sisi. So I don't think it will affect the elections in any way. Maybe if the Egyptian army will be publicly humiliated in Sinai, maybe more people will abstain. But please note, media cannot come into Sinai now. He cut any media presence in Sinai, especially in order to prevent embarrassments and humiliations for the Egyptian army.
Last week, the Russians warned Ankara that if a Turkish jet flew in defiance of the order, it would be shot down. Do you think Russia's punishing Ankara for sending forces to Idlib was effective in the long run?
Russia is playing a very sophisticated game in the Idlib area, and it's really connected with what we discussed previously about Afrin. In my opinion, and in the opinion of several analysts, the reason that the Russians actually allowed the Turks to attack in Afrin was to force the Kurdish militias in the area to let the Syrian regime in. And that's just what happened. Now, when the Russians achieved their goal, virtually letting the Syrian regime in Afrin, they don't want the Turks to expand their operation. Certainly not to Idlib, and not even in Afrin. So I think the Russians are now constraining the Turkish army more and more, because as far as Russian strategy is concerned, the Turks have played their role. We are not needed any longer.
Do you think Erdogan will follow the U.S. warning to end its Afrin expedition following the Syrian regime intervention?
I think the US warning about Afrin is irrelevant because there are no US forces in Afrin. It will be relevant if the Turks will try to continue eastwards and to attack Manbij, where in Manbij there is strong presence of US forces. So maybe we will prevent Erdogan from going eastwards to Manbij, but I don't see US warnings as having any effect in the Afrin area. Russia is the relevant actor here.
That's Dr. Danny Orbach. Thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you very much.
And now for a roundup of this week's regional headlines, the news in brief. Lebanese film director Ziad Doueri says his recent Oscar nomination in the foreign language category is a positive sign for the film. He claims he struggled to get the film released in Lebanon and other Middle Eastern countries. In the film, a Lebanese Christian mechanic gets into a brawl with a Palestinian foreman. The two end up in a court in a highly publicized trial. The film brings to light the religious and ethnic tensions that continue to divide Lebanon long after the end of the civil war in 1990. The director was insistent throughout the filming process that the story be told truthfully, without censorship, to portray the real issues facing Lebanon today. The Oscar Awards will be presented on March 4th in Los Angeles. A 6-day music fest has brought folk dance and traditional music to downtown Cairo. Hundreds attended the event, led by artist Abdel Fattah, who hoped to turn the downtown into a cultural hub. In addition to the variety of music shows, there was a light show which lit up buildings overlooking the festival. The world's longest zip line has opened in the United Arab Emirates, allowing adventurers to speed down the country's highest mountain at up to 150 kilometers per hour. The 2.8-kilometer zip line was acknowledged by the Guinness Book of World Records. Most tourists spend their time in Dubai, but the UAE hopes that this new exciting feature will attract more tourists to the area. The zip line will be able to accommodate up to 100,000 people each year. That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.